Hi everyone, this is Chef Mark with Appliance Factory in Mattress Kingdom, and I'm back continuing my series with tips and tricks on how to cook without recipes. So I got a couple of great tips that I think are going to help you out. You know, I see a lot of recipes that are written for, let's say, artichoke dip, and it calls for 10 ounces of artichokes. This can is 8.5 ounces of drained artichokes. So, should I open 2 cans and then have most of another can kicking around, maybe in the back of my refrigerator, not sure what to do with it? Well, in this case, what I would do is I would just use 1 can and a little bit of juice just to kind of help it enhance the flavor, and then test it out and see maybe the recipe's a little too thin that way. Maybe cut back a little bit of the dairy or the cream, the liquid ingredients. Make notes in your recipe, and that way, if you love this brand and you always buy, an 8.5 dry weight of artichokes, you don't have extra can kicking around. So that's just one way you can kind of customize an existing recipe. Another great tip, and I learned this from a pastry chef friend of mine who does a lot of baking, and she makes this great spiced pound cake utilizing all these dry ingredients and some salt. And, it's a teaspoon of this and 2 tablespoons of that, and it's quite a bit of measuring. So what she does is that she actually makes a large batch of it, puts it in an airtight container, and just labels it for that recipe, and she has it ready to go. And I've learned to take that one step farther. If you go to a lot of these custom spice shops, they'll actually blend that for you and put it into a jar and label it for you, and then you're ready to go. Spiced pound cake seasoning. It's a really great way to make sure that you can make these recipes a little bit quicker. So I think that's a great tip here. I try to get away from measuring cups when we're dealing with cooking without recipes. And here's how I do that. I get really consistent when I'm cooking, including using the same cookware every time I make a recipe. So let's say I'm making my artichoke dip, and I'm making a big batch here. I've got a nice big pot. And what I do is I use the rivets inside the pot as my reference point. So let's say I'm going to add some onions, 2 large onions, and then I'm going to add some oil, and I'm going to eye out my oil, then I add some flour to make a roux, and then I add some artichoke juice and some cream, and then I add my artichokes, and I'm going to puree the whole thing. What I do is I make a note that once I've added all the ingredients, it's about 1 inch below the rivets. And I just make a note of that in my recipe, or just remember that. I just remember that every time I make this recipe, that I use this pot, and that I'm really, really close to the right ratios when I'm about 2 inches below the rivets. This is what I do when I'm working in restaurants, making large batch recipes, just kind of memorizing the recipe by those visual cues. A lot of recipes are designed so that you can make something over and over again and have consistency. But keep in mind that this is a great opportunity to experiment. So if you're not worried about consistency, you can kind of eye out those recipes, and then if one really hits, it's just right, before you forget, write down some notes next to the recipe, and that way you'll know, hey, the next time I make my artichoke dip, I like it with half as much cream, but double the artichokes, and I like to add cayenne pepper, let's say. One way to break free of your measuring cups is to just test measure. So I've got a tablespoon here, and a lot of recipes really call for a tablespoon of oil. So what I'll do is I'll fill this tablespoon, pour that into a pot, and see how that looks. Then I try to make just a mental note. Oh, that's enough oil to barely cover the bottom of the pot. And every time I cook a recipe, then I try to add that much oil. For me, I like to put my oil in a squeeze bottle. That way I can just squeeze out the amount of oil I need. I like a very thin veneer in the bottom of a pan when I'm cooking. And keep in mind that it's easier to add more oil than it is to take away. So that's why I keep it in a squeeze bottle. I add a little bit. If it looks dry, I add a little bit more. I got one last tip for you. If you're making soup, a great rule of thumb is that if you've got all your ingredients, let's say I'm making chicken noodle soup and I got all my ingredients up to here, it takes about 2 inches of liquid above your ingredients. Is almost always the right amount of liquid when you're making a soup. It's a great starting spot. 2 ounces or 2 inches, so about that much above your ingredients before you bring everything to a boil. That way you don't have to sit there and measure cup after cup after cup of chicken stock when you're making soup. So hopefully these tips and tricks help you out. Make sure you like and subscribe to our channel, and thanks for tuning in.